Morning, everybody. We want to welcome you all to the July meeting of our Declinism seminar. And as you can see, the talk today is by Dr. Carlo Slavich from Firenze, Curbing the Epigraphic Habit. So I want to hand things over to Professor Ted Kelting from San Diego, who will introduce our speaker and give us a sense of how we're going to proceed.
Great, thanks, Ed. And before I do my introduction proper, I just want to kind of clarify a bit of housekeeping, which now I think is becoming familiar, but I'll repeat it all the same. And so for our discussion following Professor Slavich's talk, if you have a question or comment, please put Q for question or C for comment into the chat, and then I will call on you to ask your question or make your comment on that basis, and we'll kind of proceed through the chat. Of course, if all else fails, you can use the raise your hand feature, and I'll try to see you and keep my eyes on the kind of panels. But otherwise, through the chat would be the most, I think, productive, let's say. Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carlo Slavich, who's joining us from the University of Florence, where he also, back some time ago, received his doctorate in the political and cultural history of the Roman Empire. That project culminated in a monograph, I think from 2019, which discussed really well, elegantly, the Curatores Rei Publicae, specifically in the province of Bithynia and Pontus. In between, back when, during his doctorate, and now, he's held a postdoctoral position at the Free University of Brussels, and also collaborated on every major European epigraphic project I can kind of think of. And I wouldn't possibly list them all and all of the inscriptions he has published, because they are so many. And I understand there's a football match that we all have to turn to after his talk. But I'll single out maybe one or two. Particularly the one that sounds interesting to me is this epigraphic database of falsi, and particularly kind of this forgery business, which is so fascinating. But he's also made monumental contributions to the epigraphic database Roma, which is such a helpful resource in digitalizing Roman inscriptions. And he'll certainly be drawing on that expertise today for his talk, Curbing the Epigraphic Habit. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Carlo Slavich.
Thank you, Dr. Kelting, and thank you everyone for attending. There's much I should have to apologize in advance before starting my lecture. First about my English, then about the side sitting, because I'm going to have to turn around and read from another PC. So sorry about that, but myself, I don't want to subtract time from the football match later. So I'll start right away without beating around the bush any longer. Thank you, and see you later. I'm turning this way. I have to share the screen, I think, before I go any further. So you should be seeing the front cover. So it is a truth universally acknowledged that after 3 centuries of incessant growth, the gross epigraphic product of the Roman Empire dropped abruptly at some point during the 3rd century AD, although one cannot help but lament a lack of actual figures. It is telling, in my opinion, that the chapter dedicated to metrics, to the epigraphic habit, actually, in the most recent edition of the Oxford Handbook of Roman Epigraphy, still displays as Exhibit A this graph you are seeing, drawn in 1973 by Stanislaw Mrożek, based on a measly sample of a few thousand dated Latin inscriptions from all over the empire. It should be noted that these figures concern mostly public epigraphy, honorific inscriptions, inscription on public buildings, milestones, genre that are most likely to be dated by emperor, by year, or by means of prosopographic connections with other dated inscriptions, while the bulk of ancient Greek-Roman epigraphy, around 70% of Latin inscription, more reliable figures for Greek inscriptions under Roman rule, the bulk of Greco-Roman epigraphy is made of funerary inscriptions, which seldom come with precise dating, at least before the 4th century AD. Make no mistake, though, the rarefaction of monumental writing in the 3rd century AD, most notably of public monumental writing, is a hard fact, and one you are bound to bump into if you inquire into the epigraphic record of any given province, region, or city of the Roman Empire, no matter whether the missing inscriptions are Greek or Latin, and no matter what the epigraphic curve of that particular area looks like before and after. I'll pick a few cases on a city scale. I have some degree of personal knowledge of, not they are particularly relevant, it is just places I have been, but I could literally take as an example any city of the Roman Empire. First of all, obey. First of all, the free city of Aphrodisias, well excavated and exceptionally rich epigraphic record, totaling 1,500 inscriptions. About 100 date from the centuries from the 3rd to the 1st BC, short of 1,200 from the 1st to the mid-3rd century AD in growing numbers. The bulk of evidence is from the first half of the 3rd century AD, or latter half of the 2nd. And about 250 from the mid-3rd to the early 7th century AD, when the city was eventually abandoned. Of these, only 7 can be dated with assurance within the 2nd half of the 3rd century AD, 6 of which from the joint rule of Valerian and Gallienus, so the very first decade of this period. Under Gallienus, civic coinage also ends, never to resume in Aphrodisias. This scarcity can't be put down to any particular misfortune, although the city may have suffered some damage from the earthquakes that struck nearby cities under Severus Alexander and Gordian. The Gothic raids that ravaged Ephesus in the 260s apparently left Aphrodisias unscathed. Only 1 century later was the city walled. Apparently, the Aphrodisians simply took a 4-decade break from engraving inscriptions. Changed scenery completely. A remote municipium in the Reggio Quarta, Samnium, Sepinum, you should see here, the green mark. Remote municipium that may have been abandoned as early as the late 4th century AD. Of its 205 inscriptions, only a score are later than 250 AD. And among these, only 2 date from the 2nd half of the 3rd century, and the rest are from the 4th. Now for something completely different, left side of the map, Ostia, Rome's harbor at the mouth of the Tiber, and one of Italy's biggest cities with over 6,000 published inscriptions and many more still unpublished. I could find some 270 dating after AD 250, of which only a dozen between AD 250 and 300, which seems to me way too little and must surely be compensated with a fair share of the funerary inscriptions roughly dated to the 3rd century AD. For the sake of clarity, I'll state once again that all of these figures, much like Mrozek's graph we've seen in the first slide, should be taken with more than a pinch of salt. As Joyce Reynolds once wrote, referring to Mrozek, piling up gross statistics of dated inscriptions is of little value, and I will stop it at that. In most cities and regions, the number of newly engraved inscriptions tend to rebound in the 4th century AD, albeit at a slow pace compared to the early 3rd century, and in a very uneven way. Big cities, especially provincial capitals, show greater resilience than smaller ones. And some regions, amongst Italian regions, notably Campania and Venezia and Istria, which outperform all the rest of Italy by far, and among provinces, Africa. Shall get back to this later in this talk, but the vitality, the epigraphical vitality of African cities during the 4th and even 5th century AD has no parallel in any other part of the empire. Now, the very first attempt at finding an explanation to this puzzling epigraphic blackout across the whole Roman Empire in these crucial decades of the transition into late antiquity was made in 1982 by Ramsay MacMullen. Okay. In a 14-page article effectively titled The Epigraphic Habit in the Roman Empire. The fact itself, the blackout, I mean, of epigraphy, had passed almost unnoticed yet. According to the long-standing narrative, declinist narrative of the evolution of the principle into the dominant that had been set in stone by Mommsen's Staatsrecht, by the end of the Severan period, cities had forsaken self-government and become mere tax collection devices. A scarcity of inscriptions at the peak of the 3rd century crisis would hardly even register as a fact in this mindset. Besides, statistics and curves were just then in the 80s becoming fashionable. So MacMullen set out from the comparison of Mrozek's graph, we have already seen, with another but by Jean-Marie Lasserre, based on some 4,000 epitaphs from 7 cities in Roman Africa. Despite the samples being at first sight dissimilar by genre and provenance, the curves seem to roughly correspond. Therefore, as MacMullen argued, the shape had to respond to an independent variable, that is, an urge of engraving that rose and fell according to a logic of its own. It should be set aside for later use that although MacMullen never states it explicitly, it is implied many times throughout the paper that he regards the act of writing as inherently individual, even when it involves a whole community. For example, unidentified public inscriptions from Mrozek's statistics become, in his word, quote, text inscribed by officials. Likewise, if indigenous names start appearing amidst magistrates of a Dalmatian city, to MacMullen, it doesn't necessarily mean that those people were freshly admitted into the ruling class. Maybe they just, quote, didn't have the epigraphic habit before. One has sometimes the impression that MacMullen's thought of the epigraphic habit is something akin to graffiti. But let us return to our 3rd century blackout. And I'm reading a long chunk of Macmillan's text. It is awkward to explain the high point of the two graphs you see on the left of the slide in political or economic terms, although those would be the instruments of interpretation thrust upon us by modern teaching. Among Lasserre's 4,160 texts, only 7 postdate AD 250. Morozov takes exactly the mid-3rd-century as the hinge in the habit of epigraphy, but the nadir of the imperial currency and the period of anti-empires in the East and West under the various rulers are then yet to come. Their full effects, in turn, would hardly be expected save another decade or so. As to the peak of frequency of inscriptions, it should be found in AD 150, perhaps, or earlier. I think no one would have expected it to follow in the wake of the protracted several bouts of civil war that marked the ascendance of Severus to the throne, nor in a time of harsh proscriptions and novel taxes. Accordingly, it can only have been controlled from the beginning to the end by forces other than those conventionally invoked to explain such things. Put more sharply, no doubt too sharply, history is not being written in the right way. Now, it had been the consensus since Gibbon, or indeed since Cassius Dio and Herodian, that the Roman Empire hit its apogee under the Antonines. If the number of new inscriptions engraved each year was to be regarded as a reliable index of prosperity, how would it keep skyrocketing for another 5 decades despite war, external and serious, greedy soldiers, oppressive fiscal policies, political encroachment, earthquakes, plague, famine, and locusts? The question is a compelling one. Macmillan's answer, though, not quite as much. What those forces were, there you go, I have no idea, or rather no idea that can be substantiated. But clearly, they were of a magnitude suited to the seriousness and ubiquity of the habit they modified. Apparently, the rise and fall of the epigraphic habit was controlled by what we can only call the sense of the audience. In the exercise of the habit, people, I can only suppose, counted on the word still continuing in existence for a long time to come, so as to make merely permanent memorials worthwhile. And they still felt themselves members of a special civilization, proud or obliged to behave as such. Later, in not bothering anymore to record on stone their names or any other claim to attention, perhaps they expressed their doubts about the permanence or importance of the word. Perhaps. At least, I cannot see in the evidence anything less than the sign of some very broad psychological shift. The reader, or at least this reader, is left wondering how the same broad but otherwise nondescript psychological shift would affect other widespread social behaviors such as munificence, running for office, standing up for fellow citizens in front of the powers that be, boasting one's ancestors and relatives, behaviors that had been feeding for centuries into the so-called epigraphic habit of the Greco-Roman city. Did people not bother anymore to have their own names and deeds engraved in the marketplace and into civic memory? Or did they not bother anymore to do whatever it took to earn such a distinction from their fellow citizens? And either way, what the reason? Was it because they could not afford the price of civic memory, or because the rewards were not worth it any longer? Let us assume hypothetically that the epigraphic habit was indeed an independent variable as Macmillan would have it. Did its decline affect those behaviors? Were fewer porticos built because no wealthy citizen would bother donate the columns so that the names would be engraved on the epistyle? Did the long-standing tradition of trading munificence for civic recognition live on in other forms that did not necessarily entail the engraving of inscriptions, such as trading bread for unwritten acclamations. How long would it take for the expectation of the people to change accordingly? Throughout the paper, Macmullen seems oblivious to the fact that every act of epigraphy, every act of inscription involved necessarily more than one person, and some involve entire cities. As Joyce Reynolds duly noted in the 5-yearly review of current epigraphic research in the Journal of Roman Studies, many questions were raised by Macmullen's already famous and neatly entitled article. But beyond suggesting that a sense of audience was implied in the act of inscribing and displaying inscriptions, Macmullen's broad sweep through the epigraphic and papyrological evidence provides few answers, and that I can't help but subscribe to. Meanwhile, more serious challenges to the traditional declinist wisdom were being raised by scholars that took narrower approaches at the epigraphic source and broader approaches to their historical context. History was indeed being rewritten. The most time-efficient way of gauging the Copernican magnitude of the paradigm shift that was in progress by the time the epigraphic habit hit the bookshelves is to compare Friedrich Hörtel's handling of the 3rd century AD in the 1939 edition of the Cambridge Ancient History with Jean-Michel Carrier's in the 1996 edition. But mention must be made, at least a fleeting mention, of a few truly groundbreaking books, namely Claude Lepellet's Les Cités de l'Afrique romaine au Bas Empire, 1979, François Jacques Le Privilège des Libertés, 1984, and Charlotte Rouechet, I would pronounce it, but I'm not sure this is how an English-speaking person would. Charlotte Rouechet, Aphrodisias in Late Antiquity of 1989. Books whose influence in shaping the current continuist paradigm of the transition from early to late empire can hardly be overstated. Long story short, if I may, this new wave of research found out that a state of affairs belonging to the Tetrarchic age had been unduly projected 1 century back, 1 century earlier in time. The Greco-Roman city hit the 3rd century crisis, or vice versa, pretty much alive and kicking, with its self-government, its institutions, its ruling classes still intact. The Severans, as Jacques put it, had been more continuators of the Antonines than precursors of the Diocletians. Radical changes occurred indeed under Diocletian and Constantine, but even then, despite closer and tighter control by the imperial government, cities did not just cease to exist as self-governing political entities, and in some areas, entire provinces as the African ones, or regions as Campania, or individual cities such as Aphrodisias, they even thrived. In such areas, whole epigraphic genre that had thinned out or disappeared altogether in the late 3rd century resurfaced and sometimes even flourished once again. Now, in spite of its shortcomings, Macmullen's paper has ever since been referred to as classic, influential, groundbreaking, and the epigraphic habit, the snippet of the title, instantly became a favorite catchphrase among historians and epigraphists alike. Yet attempts at following up on the many questions it left unanswered have been few and far between, and I would argue not overly successful. Two such endeavors are invariably referenced in footnotes alongside Macmullen's, namely Elizabeth Myers' ambitiously titled Explaining the Epigraphic Habit in the Roman Empire, the Evidence of Epitaphs on the Journal of Roman Studies of 1990, and Greg Wool's monumental Writing and the Expansion of Roman Society. According to Meyer, the driving force of the epigraphic habit, what Macmullen himself had called sense of the audience, depended, quote, on a belief in the value of romanization, of which the epigraphic habit is also a rough indicator, end of quote. Meyer found evidence thereof in funerary inscriptions from both Latin-speaking and Greek-speaking cities, stressing the fact, you see a selection of Meyer's graphs on the right, stressing the fact that while in the West the epigraphic curve fell off immediately after the Constitution Antoniniana in 212, it seemed to hold on a little longer in the Greek-speaking provinces. And I read, of those inscriptions which are not funerary, most are dedications by or gifts from individuals, inscriptions which were predominantly assertions of self-worth, status, wealth, generosity, or piety, or municipal honors for the material consequences of such self-opinion. What the general curve of the epigraphic habit may therefore in fact be charting is the rise and fall of inscriptional self-aggrandizement, linked with Roman status, Roman's modes of expressions, and a belief that both were valuable. After AD 212, the expression of self-aggrandizement and commemoration may have shifted to other less clearly identifiable and perhaps more perishable forms, because the status with which inscriptions were by now closely associated was no longer privileged and prized. One blind spot of this theory is Italy, where Roman citizenship had ceased being a mark of distinction of any sort 3 centuries before the Constitution Antoniniana, freedmen aside, of course. Yet, the rise of and fall of inscriptional self-aggrandizement seems to follow the same patterns in, say, Etruria as in Bithynia. Even in the provinces, I would argue, competition for Roman status went a long way beyond Roman citizenship, and that well before AD 212. Roman status, not status, I may have garbled it a little bit, may be extended to include provincial high priesthoods, patronates, curatorships, then more patronates and curatorship, but of bigger cities, the Curia Iudicum, then equestrian militia, then marrying your second son's third daughter to some senator's cousin, and eventually maybe senatorial offspring. Past the first rounds, the ladder was exactly the same as in Italy. Meyer's point may still be valid, though, if we surmise that from the mid-3rd century onwards, the higher rounds became easier to attain by different and less inherently inscriptional means such as bribery, military feats, or sheer luck. But if that is the case, then the Constitution Antoniniana had probably little to do with it. Greg Wolf took a radically different path based on, quote, an anthropologically informed view of monumentality. Monuments, he argued, both written and unwritten, are a response to social anxieties caused by a perception of change. Thus, the ubiquity ubiquity. Of funerary monuments hardly commands an explanation. Death and subsequent loss of identity are perceived changes humans tend to be uncomfortable about, regardless of their religious conviction. Honorary inscription respond, according to Wolf, to fear of social mobility, both upwards, your own, other people's upwards social mobility, and downwards, your own social mobility downwards. Quote, the serial inscriptions of early imperial Italy may be seen as monuments that asserted individual successes against a background of growing uncertainty engendered by a dynamic and fluid society. But then, and this you should be reading, then there is the problem of the very rapid decline of epigraphic culture in the 3rd century. And this is, I guess, where Professor Wolf realized that he had written himself into a very tight corner. At first sight, the answer might seem to lie in a cessation of diminution in the force of the social factors that had made epigraphy such an attractive option in the first place. But on closer inspection, this hypothesis faces serious objection. Social mobility was a marked feature of 4th century society, supported by an expanding imperial bureaucracy and education system, and marked by a continuation of personal patronage. Astrology and magic, at least, those alternative indicators of insecurity, remained popular in the later empire. The crucial change then was not the removal of these anxieties, but the response made to them. Now, one cannot but agree that trying to explain the abrupt decline of monumental writing in the mid-3rd century with a newfound sense of security would raise a few eyebrows. But if indeed monumental writing were to be understood as an eminently individual response to social anxiety, one would rather expect the epigraphic curve to skyrocket between Decius and Diocletian. The reality of the 3rd century crisis and its actual impact on everyday life can be minimized or even denied entirely. I wouldn't, but I do agree myself with the view that its immediate effects on the self-sufficiency of civic finances and the efficiency of civic self-government may have been misrepresented by the traditional declinist narrative. But social anxiety, as defined by Wolf, is based on perceived change, and there can be little doubt as to ongoing changes in the 3rd century being perceived by contemporaries as a sign of unraveling of the empire. But let us read further. The desire to display wealth and status survived, but it seems to have been expressed largely through other media, among them grand urban and rural residences and elaborate artworks of silver plate or ivory. Links between this privatization of display and a change in the public roles of ancient cities seem likely. The virtual disappearance of euergetism and in the East of civic coinages might seem a change in public rather than private practice, but in fact the two were intimately connected. This paper has focused on the motivations of individuals because it was individuals whose actions were manifested in epigraphy. Yet civic epigraphy was an important medium for those individuals who defined their identity, at least in part, in relation to a public, usually a civic setting. The new ways in which identity was constructed and the new frames of reference in relation to which identity had to be fixed are beyond the scope of this paper. Once more, it seems clear to me that the epigraphic habit, as minted by Macmillan, has been conceived by and large as a strictly private one, individual one, even when it's public, because the two are intimately connected, although this intimate connection apparently works only in one direction. This much I understand, but to be honest, I am not sure I'm getting the point made here by Wolf, and if someone does, you are welcome to explain it to me later in the discussion. It seems to me that the notion of epigraphic habit in all three of the different formulations we have examined is based on a radical misconception of what inscriptions are. Epigraphy is an inherently social fact. There is no proper inscription that does not involve at least two people, and most of them involve many more. Honorary inscriptions require a degree of cooperation from the honorand, the dedicant, who often corresponds to an entire community, the curamagens or the curamagentes, the caretakers, the council to assign to the monument a parcel of public soil, the stonecutter, and the entire community, present and future, as readers. And I may be forgetting someone. As far as representation goes, I cannot but disagree with Wolf's statement that it was individuals, the honorands presumably, whose actions were represented in epigraphy. The honorands were represented for sure, but so were all other individuals and communities involved whose names could be read in the inscription. Cities that identified themselves by 5 or 6 lines of text, the very famous metropolis, first of the province, Sacred and Asylos, half a dozen times Neokoros. They actually claimed a fair share of the epigraphic field for representing themselves. Cities, in fact, were represented twice, once in the inscriptions and once by the statue above it. Each statue represented an individual, and that's for sure. But the stone people inhabiting public spaces collectively represented the city as a whole. The initiative of setting up a statue wasn't always up to the honorand. City magistrates probably strived for one, but patrons would often receive theirs while absent from town, and emperors weren't even aware of every statue dedicated to them unless the city sent an embassy to inform them. Public buildings aggrandize as many individuals as could sneak their names on the building inscription by co-founding or otherwise, but they also aggrandize the city in a very straightforward fashion. I will stop short of introducing the notion of family representations, which applies to honorary as well as to funerary epigraphy. On second thoughts, though, I will take a step further towards what Greg Wolf would call a sociologically informed approach. Greco-Roman epigraphy is not only a social fact, it is a total social fact, as in Marcel Maud's famous definition. These phenomena are at once legal, economic, religious, aesthetic, morphological, and so on. They are legal in that they concern individual and collective rights, organized and diffuse morality. They may be entirely obligatory or subject simply to praise or disapproval. They are at once political and domestic, being of interest both to classes and to clans and families. They are religious. They concern true religion, animism, magic, and diffuse religious mentality. They are economic for the notion of value, utility, interest, luxury, wealth, acquisition, accumulation, consumption, and liberal and sumptuous expenditure are all present. I am aware that this catchphrase, total social fact, has been invoked so many times for such different phenomena at every point of time and space that it has lost much of its shine. But it does really fit like a glove with the ubiquitous role held by epigraphy in the Greco-Roman city. We, Robert, might not have been taking a sociologically informed approach to Greek epigraphy, but when he famously labeled the Greek and the Romans as civilisation de l'épigraphie, civilizations that were defined both in space and time by the use of inscriptions, I would argue that he was positively characterizing epigraphy as the ultimate total social fact of the Greco-Roman Empire. Viewed from a social rather than individual angle, the epigraphic habit gains a different trait that manifests itself over time. It is basically a hoarding habit driven by growth. A growing city needs bigger public buildings, more supplies, more sportule, flashier entertainment, more of everything, which entails growing expenditure, even only to keep quality of life at the same level. Since public revenues tend to be rigid, growing cities are more likely to need help from benefactors, whom they reward in kind by epigraphic representations in public spaces. So long as epigraphic representation makes it easier for the benefactor to marry his second son's third daughter to that famous senator's cousin, it's a deal, and marble keeps stacking. Now, ever-growing monsters only exist in myths, and even there they do not exist very long, because it is the gods' job to hunt them down before they devour the universe. When a city stops growing, a simple fact of life that does not necessarily entail decline, political, economical, or demographical, epigraphy does too, or at the very least, its pace slowed down for a while. The same would happen, I guess, if the upward mobility of civic benefactors hit a glass ceiling, allowing room for a slightly revised version of Elizabeth Meyer's theory. Many cities of the Roman Empire, perhaps most of them, enjoyed repeated growth spurs or even booms from Augustus onwards. How much further could they all grow before some blew up, either financially or politically? And since I am aware that there are some very important continuist historians in the audience, I have a questions for you in the discussion. A question for the discussion. How does the continuist view of antiquity regard the problem of growth? Is it something declinist, intrinsically declinist, to assert that the Greco-Roman city kept growing throughout the first 2 centuries AD and could not just have gone on forever that way? So back to Mrozek's graph for some concluding remarks. Although I must agree with Reynolds that this omnipresent graph has not been of much help at figuring out what the epigraphic habit could be or why it started declining when it did, the way scholars read it does tell us something about how they view the role of epigraphy in the ancient world. Mommsen as a source, Macmullen as a selfish urge, Meyer as a means of self-aggrandizing, Wolff as an anxiolytic, and me as the yeast of civic expenditure. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Which means I am done.
Thank you, Professor Slavich, for the excellent talk. As a reminder, we'll conduct a discussion through the chat with a Q or a C, and we'll all kind of take a moment to formulate our thoughts after this thought-provoking response to the epigraphic habit. As folks kind of are getting their bearings, I might ask a question just to start us off. This is widely outside of my area of expertise, but a thing that kind of kept creeping in was coinage and numismatics as a kind of corollary here. And if possible, would you kind of talk about how it seems to me that coinage is another site where you want to move away from an individualist kind of explanatory framework. So it might fit well as kind of moving into a kind of a social perspective. Would you kind of expand on that?
Absolutely. I should, in fact, have mentioned coinage. I had, but that's one of the parts of this talk that have been butchered during the last 48 hours. And as I had promised you, Ted, I've been changing stuff around even now as I read. Yes, coinage, that's of extreme interest. The civic coinage just dies out, turns off exactly at the moment where this gap in the epigraphic record happens. In Aphrodisias or Aphrodisias, how would you say? It's the joint principate of Valerian and Gallienus, as in much of the eastern cities. But in those parts of southeastern Asia Minor, like Pamphylia, Persia and Side, or the colonies of Pisidia, or Cilicia, Tarsus, where even epigraphy lasts until the 60s, 80s, you have coinage until Aurelian. There is a very clear link between the two. And of course, I was in amazement when I read Wolf's statement that yes, it might seem that coinage raises a question of civic mentality being involved, but that and private urges are intimately connected. I think maybe one emission over 10 has the name of a city magistrate over it. All the others are monuments, written monuments to the city, to its gods, to its topography, rivers, building, whatsoever, and of course to the emperor. They are pocket statues, pocket monuments, and they are absolutely relevant. But to the social side of this discussion, in my opinion. Thank you. I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, no, it's great, and it seems to kind of be relevant for your point, and kind of an overuse on individualism is going to, they're calling something a numismatic habit would be kind of ludicrous, right? In the same way that you're pointing out for So in the meantime, we have a question from Eric Robinson.
Sono in conferenza, ti devo lasciare. Ciao, ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao.
And so Eric, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for a really excellent, interesting talk. I was hoping you might comment a little bit more about epitaphs and funerary inscriptions versus sort of public dedications and that sort of thing, and how that fares as one tries to evaluate these different theses. That it's all sort of, it's individually driven versus, it's about growth or lack of growth in cities, or the various theories that you went through. I'm wondering about how they fare, given sort of the different kinds of inscriptions and the level of epitaphs versus public civic epigraphy.
Yeah, I think there is a basically a dating problem with epitaphs, which curtails discussion. You can't really gauge how much the curve for epitaphs matches the one for, say, statue bases, and that's especially for that period. Of course, you can tell 4th century inscriptions from 3rd century inscriptions, but it is very hard to see the difference between an inscription from a funerary inscription from 240 and one from 275, and that's one of the reasons why I have decided to focus my discussions more on Mrozek's graph than on Lasserre, and to allow for some indulgence for Meyer's take, which indeed can work for, say, African epitaphs or even from the Greek-speaking provinces. But I feel that when the discussion, as long as the discussion is based on Mrozek's graph, it must be about public epigraphy. And of course, there's a point that that's what I'm most self-confident talking about. I'm not sure this was a satisfactory answer, but there's not
thank
much
you. I get it. The chronology is just too hard to trace, to fit it into the same trends that you've been commenting on and evaluating.
Yeah, I've tried to do that for those sample cities I've mentioned at the beginning, but I couldn't, and I think that that might be not just me. I think that is a widespread, a common problem.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and I think next up we have Ed Watts with a question.
Hi, Carlo. I really enjoyed that, and I thought it was really fascinating. And I am a little apprehensive about taking this back to coinage again, but I'm wondering the degree to which we can use like Egyptian provincial coinage as a kind of check against our understanding of civic coinage in other places, because it does continue for a little bit longer, right? I mean, you have Egyptian coinage through the reign of Diocletian, at least. And so I'm wondering, is there a way to look at the habit of using civic coinage in places that aren't Egypt alongside the Egyptian evidence as a kind of check against, the centralization and the monetary reforms that we get later in the 280s? Is there a way to use that Egyptian evidence to maybe focus more on the individuation within the civic coinage that is not kind of centrally controlled like Egypt? So we don't kind of get wrapped up in the politics of the larger central empires, monetary reforms of the 270s, 280s, and 290s? Or is that maybe just sort of pushing things too far?
I have a confession to make rather than an answer to give. I am totally ignorant about not only Egyptian coinage, but most things Egypt in general. I've tried to focus on areas of the empire I know best, and I must admit I have a sort of a void on 4th century Egypt. So I cannot really. I would love to be able to answer your question, but I cannot. I apologize.
All right, next up, I'm not sure whether Luo Fuqing wants to ask the question kind of out loud or maybe type it out, but it's their time up if they have one. Oh, there we go. So the question reads, thank you for your nice lecture. Since now my country is in the midnight, I cannot speak because it's very, very reasonable. My roommates are sleeping. I have a question about the definition of epigraphic habit. Is there a uniform and standard definition of this term? As far as I am concerned, I find most articles focus on the general things, but not so much deals with the details, such as formulae, wording / diction, and the customary local phrases / language. Are these also research objects for epigraphic habit?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, there is not a standard definition for this term. It has been minted by Macmullen in the article we have partially read, used in the title without giving an exact definition in the text. Then it has been picked up and elaborated onto by other scholars, even now in, excuse me, I have my own hoarding habit too. Even in this here thing, there is a chapter with the epigraphic habit in the title, but it has not been defined because it is, I guess, it is still sort of a plaything for epigraphists and historians. It is a catchphrase rather than a scientific notion, in my opinion. And when I titled the talk "Curbing the Epigraphic Habit," I meant that maybe for the foreseeable future, we could dispense with it, at least in teaching and in writing manuals, because it doesn't really bring any clarity to the discussion. So no, sadly, there's not a standard definition, and I don't think we are likely to get any soon.
Great. Next up, we have Alessio Borselli with a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Carlo Slavich, for your interesting lecture. I have a question. It can seem a simple one, but you said that we have a new growth of inscriptions in some provinces, again in the 4th and 5th century.
Yeah.
You said Africa and then Italy's. But what about northern provinces such as the Gauls, or the zones near the Germany's?
Not quite in terms of 4th century rebound, nothing remotely comparable to Africa. In Africa, there's sort of a second boom, and the same could be said about Campania, for example, in Italy, or Venezia in history. But even in places, areas, or individual cities where there is a rebound, it has nothing to do in scale with those three regions I mentioned. Those yeah, one could, but I won't do it right now. But it could be much elaborated further on the why exactly these areas are so successful epigraphically in the 4th century. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for asking my question.
You're welcome.
We have a question from Michelle Salzman. I think you're muted, Michelle.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for that fascinating run through the epigraphic ups and downs, as it were, in antiquity. So I think you're very right about the misreading of these changes. But I wanted to pick up on your question about the I guess your challenge to the continuous model. Not that I am in part, but not entirely one. And so, you know, I wanted to see how you would answer that last question in many ways, because you have a rise, or not so much continuity, but an increase in certain places. And so what you're projecting is different sort of regional, you know, if I can gather, responses in epigraphy to civic as well as personal and social factors. That it's a much more nuanced image of late antiquity that we need to draw. That doesn't seem to me to challenge the continuous model insofar as you're suggesting these habits are always there, or possibly there to draw on depending on factors. What we see is a very much a regional differences having to deal with both personal and private and public developments. Is that what you're arguing for? Would you agree with that? Would you revise the model so it should go longer and later? Or are you simply saying that we can't know, there is no, the dating is so insecure that we can't even make that statement? So just wanting to ask.
I totally agree on the fact that well, if I've got your question right, we are talking about the continuation of growth and why it differentiates. Well, about Africa, for example, this has been, in my opinion, satisfactorily answered by Lepellet. I totally align with that. Africa had a somewhat later growth. The phenomena that you can see going on in, say, Gaul or Spain in the second century AD you get them in spades in Africa in the Severan period. The crisis, the gap in the evidence begins somewhat earlier, and that Lepelley connects with the revolt in 238. Then the reprise, the revival begins 15-20 years earlier under Diocletian. There is a very different staggering of similar phenomena throughout the imperial period in Africa. I find it totally legitimate and understandable that different regions may have different patterns of growth. If that was what you were asking me.
Yeah, just
I'm not sure. I may have got lost in the middle of your question at some point, so I'm not sure if this is what you expected from me.
I was just asking about the why I suppose I could reframe it as, so eventually we have continuity, but eventually, say even in Africa, post 5th century, we don't have the epigraphic habit anymore. So I guess the question is how you explain that, right? You know, so we do see, yes, you answered partially the ups and downs, but we do have a falling out at a certain point. So can you use that?
Yeah, and in Africa, just as anywhere else, yeah, of course. I mean, the eventual decline, or you may not call it decline, but at some point we have to admit transition from the ancient Greco-Roman civilization and something else, many different things. Yeah, of course, that I am willing to admit. And it is, and that's also interesting. The 7th century, early 7th century, seems to be another hard line, much like the mid-3rd and early 4th, for many different areas of the Roman Empire that at that point in time I cannot even perceive anymore as intimately connected. So that could be confusing.
Great. And next up, we have a question from Giovanni.
Partially, you have answered to my question about regional differences, how what is their impact on your analysis concerning Africa. We perhaps yes, we can talk. Speak as we have had an African boom. Maybe it's a word too strong, because there are some period in the 1st century when, following Lepelley's analysis, there was a down. For example, in the Constantinian period, there is a growth in the Diocletian period, tetrarchy, and then a down, and then again a up during the Valentinian, especially Valentinian 15 years, and perhaps Theodosian partly Theodosian too. In the 5th century, for Le Pelle, there is a decline, absolute decline of the African civilization, evaluated also through the decline of public epigraphy. But my idea, my question was about the problem of regional differences to construct a general model.
Yeah, regional differences and general model. I think I have elaborated my own model and my own, so to say, theory crafting, mostly thinking of those quite different, quite afar from each other, those areas of the empire I know best. And maybe I did at some point inadvertently mention them. I think I have compared Etruria to Bithynia at some. So I haven't systematically asked myself or the evidence if that model could fit each and every area, every region of the Roman Empire. And I know I am totally aware, to some extent, I expected this to pop up during the discussion. I mean, people with different regional specialization challenging this model based on the fact that in Britain, well, Britain, that's a case in point. Britain, this is totally worthless, everything I said, as long as Britain is concerned. The epigraphic habit, whatever it is, I'm not sure I've understood. I find most of the texts I've been reading extraordinarily obscure. The epigraphic habit, whatever it is in Britain, is totally something else. All that talk about euergetism, self-representation in public, it has no place. So I expected someone to raise this issue of different regionality, and has been made. I have to confess, you know, Giovanni, that I'm a terrible liar. I have to confess that I written what I did, thinking of places I know, and I've tried to make that clear right off the gun. So
no, but that you are not a liar. It's legitimate, and I appreciate very much your paper, Carlo. I'm very glad of your happy of your fascinating and interesting paper. Appreciated, really.
Great. I think we also have a question from Brandon Green.
Hi, thank you so much for that. First of all, I apologize. I missed the first 5 minutes of your paper, so you may have already referenced it, but I was just reading this wonderful article by Monica Hellstrom in the last Journal of Roman Studies, which I think you'd be very sympathetic to because it both challenges the traditional curve of the decline, but also situates that in structural, institutional changes rather than necessarily just individual. Anyway, just to get that citation in, My question is,
thank you. I didn't know it, and thank you very much. I will see it not tomorrow because it's Saturday, but Monday morning.
No, it's a wonderful piece about building inscriptions in Africa. But my question is, I mean, I personally still find the term epigraphic habit very useful because specifically it is kind of vague and it allows, you know, all kinds of different motivations and changes to be incorporated. And one of those changes that I think has to be acknowledged is, in a kind of broader social and cultural sense, a changing attitude towards the value of posterity, however you want to define that. And at the same time, in the 3rd century, I feel you also have a changing attitude towards values of the past. And specifically, I'm thinking about reuse of inscriptions and especially statue bases. My question would be, what do you think about the idea that our data set is inherently flawed because so many 3rd century inscriptions and statue bases especially end up getting chewed up and reused in the 4th century?
Not only 3rd century inscriptions, 2nd century inscriptions often get chewed up in the 3rd. This Italy, Etruria, the region I know in most.
Our other folks may be having, I don't know if it's just me, Carlo, but I think you may be coming in and out. Would you just repeat, what you were just kind of going through?
Okay. Yep. About reuse in Etruria, in the region I know best, 2nd century inscriptions are chewed up in 3rd century baths. It is not a phenomenon exclusively affecting this latter chunk of epigraphic production, and chewed up inscriptions, those you find, they are in some cases the only inscriptions you find. There's one wonderful site which is Centuncelle, the Trajan's Harbor, north of Rome, where all that the epigraphy that you have is first or 2nd century epigraphy from Ostia, which has been reused in the marble, how do you call marble plating of the baths in the 4th or 5th century. I don't think reuse specifically affects the preservation rate of 3rd century epigraphy. On the other hand, the point you made about public memory, that too, I'm not even sure that it specifically concerns the 3rd century. There are cases like Priene in Ionia. Priene is a small, very well preserved city with a huge epigraphic record compared to its size. It has some 1,200 inscriptions, although more than a half are seat inscriptions in the circus. Of those, maybe 50 are from Augustus onward, and there are in public places like 6 or 7 inscriptions from the imperial period and many hundred from the Hellenistic times. Still, we know that the city remained inhabited and politically functioning until the 4th century AD. It kept minting coinage. It has at least one civic magistrate honored in a public place in this 3rd century AD. But as far as the epigraphic habit goes, as far as honoring benefactors or leading citizens in public places during the imperial age, they had none. And why is that? I think that a city that had its civic temple erected by Alexander the Great, who features in the building inscription of the Temple of Athena Polias, and so much prestige from its Hellenistic benefactors, and was in the 2nd century AD a tourist destination for people like Pausanias, that describes when I go to Ionia, there you find the best sanctuaries, most well-preserved sanctuaries in the whole Greek world, who went there because they thought they'd find a sanctuary of Greekness, of what a Greek city was like 4 centuries earlier. Well, their magistrates that we know through coinage didn't feel the urge to litter the city center with their own image. They contented themselves with keeping it just as it was. So that's one very specific case where the epigraphic habit, so to say, works its own way because of a matter of preservation of heritage of Greek culture. I am positive that Priene had magistrates, had festivals, had anything that you could find in any other city. Yet it didn't become monument because it would have encroached on monuments that define the collective image of the city and made it attractive to foreigners. So yeah, that point you make, I think, is hugely relevant, and there may be many other cities I don't have direct knowledge of where the same applies. Thank you.
We're kind of close to up against our final time, but if there's a final question, I'm sure we could have it. Great. Otherwise, I'll hand things over to Giovanni for wrapping up. And in the meantime, let's thank Carlo again for a thought-provoking and really engaging talk.
Thank you, Ted.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience and understanding.
Yes, I'm really pleased with the quality of our seminars, of our lectures, and thank Carlo for your speech, your talk, and thank Ted for your excellent leadership of this today, for your leadership of the discussion. I'm then very happy to I try to share the screen. Can you see something?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm happy to announce that I can say my friend of many years now and dearest colleague and admirable scholar, Michel Salzman, will be with us next Friday, not really next Friday, but Friday, July 16. And we will have a new occasion to talk about declinism, and this intriguing title, which the use of the word resilience. I'm very curious to hear and to Michel. And have a nice day in California, and good evening in Italy. Now, if you please, I should get going and prepare myself psychologically for the European Championship of Soccer or Football. In half an hour, we will watch Italy against Belgium. Good night, and see you
Giovanni,
soon.
may I ask Mr. Brandon Green a question?
Sure.
Brandon,
Yes.
have you been to Formia?
Yes, I
Is
just
that from
went.
Formia?
I was there last summer.
That's an impressive first century Zeitgesicht. It is printed in my memory. I had,
So there's my.
I've recognized it. Thank you.
And goodbye all, and to the next.
Bye
Thank you,
bye.
everyone.
Bye
I know.
Bye, Serena. Bye, Michelle.
bye bye bye.